When it signed its outline deal with President Trump, a deal that critics said was basically a surrender, remember? The European Union may have hoped that, having conceded so much, it had at least bought a period of reprieve from Trump bullying. But of course, like any bully, or extortionist might be the better analogy, it never stops after the first success, because they always come back for more. So it seems here, just months after reaching its trade deal, the United States is now demanding that the EU abandon key parts of its green legislation. We already know that the Trump administration has thrown overboard any such legislation for its own country, but we've also noted that it is on an outreach mission to push the rest of the world to follow suit as well. Many of those trade deals that it struck with different countries included pushing American fossil fuel supplies onto the signatories. And outside of trade, the administration has been doing things like pushing the International Energy Agency to drop its analysis of the progress worldwide towards an energy transition, telling it to fall in hard behind fossil fuels instead. Well, the EU has long been seen as having the most strict and unforgiving environmental regulations of anywhere in the world. So it's not surprising that the US government is now seeking to push back against some of those. For example, Brussels requires non-EU companies to provide climate transition plans. Trump has demanded that they scrap such requirements in relation to American corporations. Brussels also requires companies to ensure their supply chains are free from deforestation and forced or child labour. Again, Trump believes the US has such high-quality corporate due diligence that those requirements shouldn't apply to its companies. And then there's the bloc's belief that it should be able to regulate America's tech giants in how they operate within Europe, pushing on them things like data protection and similar standards. All of it, according to a US government position paper seen recently by the Financial Times, counts as, quote, serious and unwarranted regulatory overreach that imposes significant economic and regulatory burdens on US companies. The EU legislation's onerous supply chain due diligence obligations, climate transition plan requirements, and civil liability provisions will adversely impact the ability of US companies to compete in the EU market. Now, one thing that the EU has been pretty consistent about, since the days when technology was monopolised by Microsoft, is its determination to set standards for the tech monopolists. To be fair, it's not always resulted in useful, sound legislation. I mean, I don't know how many million human hours were sacrificed by European bureaucrats' decision that every website everywhere should ask if you're happy with cookies or not. But in other cases, it has been prepared to challenge the social media giants in ways that forced them to acknowledge and respond to allegations about the harm their services can cause some of the users. You'd certainly take the right of a country or a region to set those sorts of rules for themselves. It's a basic part of being a sovereign entity, you would think. If the EU decides to be too bureaucratic, too expensive, well fine, it will reap the consequences as it fails to compete on innovation and much else besides. Maybe such legislation is a colossal mistake, but it's pretty indisputably its mistake to make, and hopefully to learn from, if mistake it is. But not as far as Trump's concerned. Now, part of that has been provoked by the EU's inclination to stick massive penalties onto non-compliance. For instance, the EU sustainability reporting rules, which demand that companies report on hundreds of data points, while failure to comply with those rules can result in fines of up to 5% of global turnover, which is potentially a huge hit. And if all jurisdictions started throwing rules around with penalties based on the size of your global turnover, very quickly you end up with major corporations that simply dare not risk doing business outside of their home market. And it's influential with Trump, of course, that American oil and gas business, ExxonMobil, has been one of the chief complainants about the EU rules. Its chief executive, Darren Woods, described the penalties as bone-crunching on a recent earnings call. The thing is, it was always obvious that the US-EU trade deal had glaring clauses in that just invited Trump to keep coming back for deeper and deeper bites. While the deal set tariffs on most EU products at 15%, it left open scope for further concessions by Europe. For instance, saying that undue restrictions should not be imposed on transatlantic trade, which can mean anything you want it to mean. The EU has said that its regulations are a red line that it's not prepared to cross. That's the official reaction. That's always been the official reaction, but it's become obvious that that is a lot less robust than it pretends. Not least because internal pushback has been leading the EU to water down a number of its rules even without pressure from Trump's America. So regulations to ban deforestation and labour abuses and to push companies on their environmental impact. These have seen their implementation delayed, some of them several times, their provisions weakened, their scope narrowed. But even without that, there are problems. The US is not happy about the EU's carbon border tax, which should kick in next year. These ensure that polluting industries outside the bloc, such as aluminium and steel manufacturers, are not able to undercut European producers by going for lower environmental standards. So having won a remarkably unequal trade deal from the EU in the first place, getting from that the sense that the EU is extremely weak in the face of Trump's actions, what a surprise that Trump is back for another bite. And the question is whether, having supposedly gotten a deal, does the EU have the stomach for pushing back against the next wave of demands, even at the cost of then losing the deal that they thought they already had secured? Because this is the point with Trump. He signs a bit of paper. Bits of paper can be torn up at any time. None of this his word is his bond rubbish here. Just day to day, minute to minute, what leverage could I exploit to bring the other side to heel? Now, all of this has consequences that ripple on through the world trading system. So, for example, the EU has been swamped with cheap Chinese steel, which, thanks to Trump's tariffs, now need to find alternative markets in the world. Presumably, its carbon border tax isn't going to deal with it alone. Hence, it has announced it will put 50% tariffs onto its own steel and aluminium imports. The aim is to level the playing field with China, but those within the EU who are still smarting from Brexit don't seem to mind much at all, but it also hits the British steel industry a potentially fatal blow, because the majority of British steel is exported to Europe. So there's that. And this is the sort of consequence that you get from sudden, massive changes in trading conditions in one part of the world. Whole industries can suddenly find the rug pulled from under them for no fault of their own as the consequences cascade down. While all this was going on, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was meeting for yet another summit in the White House. Canada, of course, unlike the EU and the UK and many others, has not yet agreed to egregiously one-sided and open-ended terms deal. The result is that tariffs, some of them anyway, remain high. But given Trump's already evident appetite for coming back for bigger and deeper bites of the pie after the deals have been done, only time will tell if Canada has really done badly or whether it's actually done well by itself with this harder line approach. Within Canada, hardliners like Ontario Premier Doug Ford are getting impatient with the lack of progress, pushing for more confident retaliatory action. And it's kind of hard to see right now what Canada would have to lose if it did so. But of course, as ever, we don't know what progress is being made behind closed doors. The main winner for all of this still seems to be China, which has been all over the World Trade Organization this week, presenting itself as the leading force seeking trade stability, the defense of the world rules-based trade order. Chinese lead delegate to the WTO, Li Yongji, said that the US was promoting power-based trade relationships that are eroding the rules-based trading system, whose purpose is, after all, to protect the interests of smaller players. And right now, there's an appreciative audience amongst many of those players. And representatives from the EU, Brazil, Australia, Switzerland, Pakistan and others joined China in calling for upholding the fundamental principles of the WTO. This came as the forecast for global trade for next year was revised downward to 0.5% from the previous forecast of 1.8%. A massive depression of the global economic outlook, arguably all down to the whims of just one person. Nevertheless, underneath those figures, there was an awareness of more of those unintended consequences, some of which go the other way. Trade among developing economies seeing a notable rise. Basically, trade between all countries not called the United States are on a growth curve. It's just going to take a while before that's strong enough to compensate for the sudden and arbitrary disruptions from America's act of, shall we call it, heroic self-sabotage.